All right. Welcome, and happy holidays to everyone who is celebrating. My name is Anitra Henry, and I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives for IPR. I'm excited to welcome you all to the last session for 2021 of Race in the PR Classroom, presented by the Institute for Public Relations and the PRSA Educators Academy. We are so grateful you are all here with us today. Joining me today from the PRSA Educators Academy is Dr. Nika Logan, Associate Professor at Virginia Tech University. Wave, Nika. IPR and the PRSA Educators Academy have been partnering on race in the PR classroom since June 2020. In that time, we have featured primarily leaders who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color talking about race in the PR classroom. Today, we will be focusing on Indigenous voices and their experiences in and out of the classroom. We are excited to share these leaders' perspectives with you and look forward to our discussion. Today, I'd like to welcome our hosts, Dr. Meta Karstafit, professor at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Christina Azokar, professor at San Francisco State University, and Nancy Spears, contributing reporter at The Imprint and student at the University of Oklahoma. Thank you all so much for being here and sharing your personal experiences with us. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping rules. This is a Q&A style forum. To ask a question, all you have to do is drop it in the chat or raise your virtual hand using the Zoom function. Once you're called on, please remember to state your name and your organization. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, please type the message to the host in the chat. So you can select me, Anitra Henry, or Dr. Nika Logan, and we will read your question aloud for you. Only moderators are able to see your question, so you will remain anonymous. Today's session will be recorded and will be available for playback later today on the IPR website. Lastly, please remain respectful to our hosts and others on the call by keeping yourself muted at all times unless you intend to speak or ask a question. And now I'll hand it over to you, Nika.
Thank you so much, Anitra, and thank you so much to everyone for being here today, and especially our panelists who are going to share some exciting information and with us today. So I think a really good place for us to start is by having each panelist talk a little bit about how you integrate Native American and Indigenous concerns into your work, how you found this work, and how you integrate it into your teaching. So basically, why don't you start by telling a little bit about what today's topic means to you and why it's important. And I think with that, I will ask Dr. Karstafan to begin to kick us off.
Nika, thank you so much for such a warm welcome, and also Anitra. I'm really honored to be speaking to you from the ancestral home of the Caddo Nation and the Wichita affiliated tribes. Today, 39 federally recognized tribes currently live in Oklahoma, initially here as a result of colonialism and settler policies. But as Nika said, my first name is Meta, or maybe she didn't, but I want to say that not to be confused with Meta, formerly known as Facebook. So if you see me, Meta. As I said, I'm really excited to be part of this discussion. And by way of introduction, I really wanted to illuminate my standpoint on this issue by looking at it through three frames: relocation, reflection, and remembrance. Relocation is the easiest. In 2002, I accepted an offer to join the University of Oklahoma's newly established Gaylord College of Journalism and Mass Communication. I became a tenured faculty member, and in that moment, I became the first African-American tenured professor on the faculty of this program since its founding in 1913. At that time, it was a program in the College of Arts and Sciences, and then became elevated to a college, hence my opportunity to join the program in 2002. So my journey here from Texas and also my home place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was an ongoing search for how I would find myself as a scholar, as a professional, as a professor, and as a new resident of Oklahoma. As part of that journey, I found myself in the Oklahoma Historical Center, and one of the long-term employees, once he learned that I was associated with the journalism program, literally pulled me aside and gave me these type sheets of paper that had lists of titles of what he called the Indian newspapers and the Black newspapers. And they existed and published in the 19th century before Oklahoma reached statehood in 1907. So just as a scholar, I was fascinated. There were titles and names I had never heard of. And again, their origins went back to the 19th century. So over the years, as I kind of continued to read these newspapers in and out of high demand teaching seasons and administrative and leadership posts, high service, the kinds of things that we're all familiar with, not to mention personal obligations. I wrestled with coming to a story about these newspapers. And just like the biblical Jacob, I wrestled until I found my voice in the story. And that story is the subject of my current book called Writing Home, which is under contract with Peter Lang Publishing and a winner in the AJMC Scholar Sourcing Competition. But before that book, thank you, I had the opportunity and really privilege to work with John Sanchez, who's faculty member at Pennsylvania State University. He and I teamed up to do a book that, as we discovered, was the first comprehensive look at American Indians in the mass media. So we considered history, journalism, advertising, all under one gaze. And that was a profoundly informative and meaningful experience for me. Next stage, reflection. Somewhere along the way, and I really can't even pinpoint when, but I began to reflect on what I knew and what I didn't know, more importantly, about Indian America. I learned that I knew very little. And I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I asked myself, how was it that I could grow up surrounded as part of my vocabulary location names like Allegheny, Susquehanna, the Poconos Mountain, all rooted in Indigenous history and tradition, and have no clue of the Indigenous people, of the culture, of the situation. And it stuns me even now to think about that situation. And yet I guarantee most of us can probably replicate that sense of knowing and unknowing in whatever location we are in the country. The last stage I wanted to speak briefly about is remembrance. And this is the most difficult. In the time after the Emancipation Proclamation, now imagine with me, there's an African American man, a former slave, and he marries a full-blooded Choctaw woman. This woman is a beautiful singer. She has long hair. And this is the fragment of a memory that my mother has of her grandmother. This is passed down in family lore, but it is an enigma and a mystery. This woman, my ancestor, is nameless to me. at this point. So I guess I am here in conclusion as kind of a confluence of many things, but as life does, circumstances have faced me where it really seems urgent to me in my research and also personally to connect the meaning of place, memory, and story. And I look forward to talking more about that later this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karstefan. You are such a beautiful and powerful storyteller. I felt that, and many of us here today probably felt like we were right there with you along your journey and what you described. And I really appreciate that you began with a land acknowledgement and then also talked about how we are all in places that we know so little about. Only recently did I learn that Virginia Tech sits on the Tutelo and Monacan people's land. And so your land acknowledgement reminds me to pay homage and respect to that. And that's something that we can all do and learn more in learning about the spaces that we occupy. Next, I'd like to direct attention to Nancy and see if you'd be kind enough to share with us your journey.
Thank you so much for having me again, Anitra and Mika. I really appreciate being here today. My name is Nancy Marie Spears. That's my full byline. I'm an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation, and I have unconfirmed Chickasaw Choctaw descent on my mother's side, so I am what you would call an intertribal white passing journalist. I've spent the majority of my time covering Indigenous affairs, so I've started actually my very, very first story as a freshman at Daily, which was the other publication part of subsidiary of Gaylord News. My very first story was actually a front page story, and it was about the real complex relationship between the university and the tribes of the state of Oklahoma. It's pretty well known these days, at least, the University of Oklahoma sits on once stolen land. In my story, it was a bold story and my editors loved it, but it was essentially a story about that relationship across time and how the former presidents of the university had treated Indigenous students, Indigenous enrollees, things like that. So that's kind of when I got my start to really realize the underrepresentation in my community of Indigenous communities. Long story short, I basically started doing what I do out of what I saw as a scarcity, a need of what needed to be covered in my industry. I knew I was very fortunate going into my freshman year of college that I already knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to major in journalism. Main reason being was because of the storytelling aspect. And storytelling is very, very, very central and important to every aspect of Indigenous communities, of course. But I wanted to do something that would really challenge narratives of what I had been seeing on campus and beyond about Indigenous communities, specifically in media representation, advertisement representation, everything that goes into the public perception of indigeneity. So going off of that, like I said, I started this work when I was a freshman. I'm a senior now. I graduate in May of 2022 with a print journalism degree. Thank you. So the specialty has taken me to numerous opportunities that I never knew I would get, because I am pretty rare as the primary Indigenous affairs reporter for my student publication. That took me out to a lot of different opportunities. I led a national project for ASU where I spanned several states and did several reservations of coverage on different Indigenous reservations across the country, specifically in the West. And then I recently concluded my time as the Indigenous Affairs DC correspondent for Gaylord News, where I covered a lot on the interior, the Supreme Court, things regarding very, very big picture issues like the McGirt decisions, Indian Child Welfare Act, really, really fundamental areas of Indigenous law that, if dismantled, could create really, really huge problems in Indian country. So with all that being said, I really wanted to challenge the narrative and help non-Indigenous folks and Indigenous people, just the entire community and public at large, understand the nuances of Indian country and why it's important that we understand them fully and give them the due justice that they deserve and that they've earned throughout history. It's just something that I'm always seeing and always trying to go against in my work, is that, Indigenous people are often not seen in society in a modern context. We are stuck very often in times in people's minds in a historical context. In fact, a lot of us aren't really seen as Indigenous people unless we're wearing a regalia, for example, or a feathered headdress or something that's very iconically, distinguishable to a non-Indigenous person as an Indigenous symbol. But if we don't have those things, we're not really seen as Indigenous, or we're not seen as here in the modern society context. And I think that's a really big problem. I think that it's indicative of a larger systemic education problem, a larger race relations problem within the public. Just in the last election, we were called by CNN as something else. We all remember when that came out. It was just a very offensive thing. But it's really indicative of a larger issue. It's going back to the statistics that we saw earlier last year that showed that, what was it, 37 or 40% of people didn't even know that Indigenous people were still around or still existed. It was a very large number, a deplorably high number that shouldn't be that high, really. And so every day in my work, what I try to do as an intertribal journalist is to bring the Indigenous narratives to the forefront, let them be voices in their own story, in their own history, because their voices should be included. Obviously, it's their story. And I think that to really elevate the truth of the history and everything going on, especially in regards to the land acknowledgements, and just everything involved with all of the issues that we're seeing in Indian country right now. I think we could really see a shift in that if we start shifting the narrative to really include the voices that matter to the conversation, and always making sure you have Indigenous voices at the table. So with that, I've done tons of work as a journalist, but also as a research scholar, and I've done tons of research as far as, we'll get into this later probably, but I did research for Johns Hopkins University for their COVID mapping project on Indigenous communities, basically covering infection rates and deaths of COVID-19 across tribes around the United States. And so that led to some really, really illuminating things about the sociological impacts of the pandemic on these communities. And I think that all really plays into how I kind of orient myself in the work that I do now. And I'm really excited to kind of continue this discussion about my perspective as a journalist, which I'm sure is different than a lot of the women here. As you know, will never say that I'm trained in PR scholarship. But I think that I bring in a unique view because of my history as a journalist, as an intertribal young person. So I'm really excited to kind of keep going on that track, but I will stop while I'm ahead. And if I have any more, if you have any more questions, or if I need to add anything, let me know.
Nancy, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. And thank you so much for bringing visibility to Indigenous communities and Indigenous issues. One of the things we'll talk about later is why the presence and the voices of Indigenous people and experiences are so suppressed as to why we know so little. But I really appreciate how you articulated the nuances in terms of intertribal relations and all of the factors that go into Indigenous advocacy. So thank you so much. And look forward to learning more, and super impressed that you're still a student. Just have to say that. All right, Dr. Azokar, would you share with us a little bit about your journey?
Sure, and again, thank you, all of you who invited me here today. I have a cold, so I'm going to be a little more brief than I planned, and I also am on cold medicine, so I wrote this down so I didn't sound so jumbled. So forgive me for reading. I want to acknowledge that I'm in San Francisco, which is in the unceded territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. I also want to say that I believe land acknowledgements need to be more than an acknowledgement, but a promise to do something to ensure the continued survival of the Indigenous people who are still here. So my part of that is being the faculty guide for the Native students on our campus. The organization is called SKINS, the Student Council of Intertribal Nations, which is spelled with a capital K, which I always loved. I'm a citizen of the Upper Mattaponi Indian tribe, which is in what is now known as the state of Virginia. My tribe has always existed in this place. And even though Jamestown was colonized in 1607, we have been able to survive. My tribe was part of the originally Powhatan Confederacy, which included the Pamunkey tribe, Pocahontas, who all of you are familiar with, was a member of that tribe, but it wouldn't have been until 2015 that the government would have considered her to be Indian, because none of the Virginia tribes had federal recognition until this century. My tribe received recognition through an act of Congress in 2018. We weren't able to be recognized through what is called the federal acknowledgement process because of the 1924 Racial Integrity Act, in which Walter Plecker, the first registrar of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics and a known white supremacist, changed all the Indians' birth certificates to either Black or white, depending on his definitions. In order to be federally recognized, tribes must provide a paper trail of lineage starting in 1900, but Plecker's act of paper genocide rid Virginia of all of its indigenous people. So I give this history because it is my history, and it's led me to where I am today. What led me to write News Media and the Indigenous Fight for Federal Recognition, which will be coming out in January. The book is a culmination of my 30-year journey to really understand the news media's role in defining who gets to be Indian, and how that definition has been instrumental in guiding federal Indian policy for at least the last 200 years. So right now, I'm a professor in the journalism department at San Francisco State, where I'm also an alumni from that department, and I teach classes on grammar. And the reason I teach classes on grammar is because it's a break of teaching about all the other hard stuff, which I do in my cultural diversity and social impact of journalism classes. I'm a past president of the Native American Journalists Association, which is a huge resource for anybody who teaches anything on media and journalism, whether it's journalism or PR or any kind of communication. And I also directed the Center for Integration and Improvement of Journalism for 10 years under, and I started under John Funabiki, who many of you may have heard of. And John was instrumental as part of the organizing of Unity Journalists of Color in 1990. Was it 4? I can't remember the date now, in which 8,000 journalists of color came to Atlanta to talk about our common issues. And that's when I met all of these Native journalists. And I didn't know that there were just so many Native journalists. I didn't know that there was a Native American Journalists Association. So it's pretty amazing that that after all of this time, that NAJA is a huge resource. There's a very large number of tribes across the nations that are represented by NAJA journalists. And so my goal in education is to make sure all of my students graduate with a basic understanding of indigeneity in the US. And that's something that none of us learned in grade school. And I will stop there. Like I said, it's a little briefer, but I'm kind of losing my voice, so I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Dr. Zokar, thank you so much for pushing yourself to the limit today and not feeling well. And thank you for, you just dropped so many gems or bombs, depending on how one wants to look at it. But I had not heard of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, never heard of paper genocide, and all of these things that contribute to an erasure. And one of the things we can all think about is what's behind, what is the power behind the erasure, and what purpose does that erasure serve in an ongoing manner. You said so many things that were wonderful. But one of the areas that I think I want to use as a springboard, and this is not on our list of questions, so forgive me, but it's inspired by the moment, was this idea that land acknowledgements are great, but we need more than that. We need action. So I would like for our panelists, in no particular order, maybe to answer this particular question. As teachers, we hold a very powerful and important role. What can we do through our roles as teachers, and what do you do through your roles as teachers to inspire action? Of course, raising awareness of these issues is important, but what can we do to take the next step to inspire change? What actions do you recommend, that do you utilize beyond what you've already shared?
Well, I think it's very important, following the comments of my colleagues, to create and to be intentional about creating spaces for Indigenous voices. And I think it begins there. Um, in my own classrooms, to the extent that I am privileged to have Indigenous students part of it, as was privileged to have Nancy, but there's not a crowd. And so I don't ever want her to feel, or someone like her feel, okay, now you speak for all Indigenous groups, but allow her the space to create her own voice and speak to those issues and create an environment where we will all listen. More intentionally, I would bring Indigenous colleagues in to speak to my class. But unlike maybe generally we think of inviting people in and here's the topic of the day, speak to that. When I do it, it's more collaborative. I say, okay, this is generally what we're talking about. Can you help me think about ways in which the importance of Indigenous nations can figure into this conversation? As a result, I've had a colleague talk about the brilliant way in which the Chickasaw Nation, for instance, has promoted tourism in the state of Oklahoma over the objections of a big name PR agency that wanted to lean in on stereotypical portrayals. And she talked about how having that conversation with tribal members in the room who were able to push back and say, no, we're not going to wear a headdress, or no, we're not going to talk about the trade stores where you can, buy trinkets, but we really are going to lean into what our culture means. And it's a beautiful campaign. And she was able to demonstrate in real time the value of having Indigenous voices in the mix.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carr-Stefan. I do have your commentary there led me to a question for Christina. I'm so sorry, not for Christina, but for Nancy. I'm going to let Dr. Azokar rest her voice just a little bit more tea and soothing. But Nancy, can you tell us a little bit about the dualities of being an Indigenous student and scholar? And in relation to your experiences in the classroom, did you feel like instructors and fellow students engage in silencing behaviors or more authentic efforts like the ones Dr. Carr-Stefan just described to really value Indigenous knowledge and experience?
Yeah, thank you for that very thoughtful question. I'll start off by just kind of throwing out a phrase that I use a lot to kind of think about this in almost like a movement sort of capacity, if we're going to talk about movement coverage and things like that. I like something that I've been seeing a lot in just the shifts of narratives and the shifts of priority, perhaps legislatively and things like that. I call it the WASH movement, the We Are Still Here movement. And I call it that because obviously we are here. We've been here. We never left. So we are still here. The reason that that's really important to me, and it's a really central mantra, I feel like, to my work, because I feel like so much of what I'm doing in my work is educating others. I definitely consider myself a societal educator. I'm an objective educator of these issues. And I think that, to be very plain about it, the dualities are very complex. And a lot of that has to do absolutely with my appearance. And, this is something that we have to be very candid to talk about, because it's not something that I can avoid talking about. It's a very forward fact about myself, but the other most forefront fact about myself that I always try to get across is my Indigenous identity. I've always had this very big identity crisis of feeling very Indigenous and very strongly traditional on the inside, but outwardly not really being able to physically express that. So I use that because I feel like so much of what my work is doing is having to educate and kind of go back in time and reestablish and re-explain concepts in Indian country, re-explain what tribes actually are, re-explain that they are not racial identities, but are in fact political entities and sovereign nation identities. You know, Indigenous people are the only minority in this country that have to have an identification card to tell you who you are. There is no other minority in this country that's like that. So to say that it's a racial category is simply not true. And we're seeing this with the challenge of the Indian Child Welfare Act in the Texas Supreme Court. They are alleging that it's unconstitutional because of a race-based application. So a lot of what I spend my time doing, I find, is educating on basic concepts that should be in basic education already. You know, and on the one hand, because I've been doing this so long, like I said, I have covered a range of issues in my time, but I would like to say that I specialize in Indigenous coverage. That's where my heart is. On one hand, I've been doing Indigenous affairs so long that I do have a very strong journalism student reputation of having all the contacts, of knowing all the things, of having all the stories and doing the best work in my class on Indigenous affairs. And that's the reputation that I've been built that's been positive towards it. But the other side of the coin for that is it becomes very tokenizing. Mm-hmm. You know, I've gone through everything from seeing the hierarchy of different races and how they are prioritized by different minority groups, to outright discrimination, to racist comments from an editor to a journalist. I mean, I've seen it all. I think part of that is because of definitely my appearance, but most of the fact that I've done this for so long, and it makes me, to the outside source, it makes me seem very knowledgeable. But because of my appearance, I'm undermined in that way. So diversity is almost a double-edged sword that kind of works against me in a lot of these cases. I am not Indigenous looking enough to necessarily fit into the full-blood communities that I can be a part of. My uncles, my aunts that I have in Montana, I look different than them. I don't necessarily fit in the Indigenous scope. And I am not personally identified enough to really feel like I am entirely belonging in Western culture either, because I am a traditional young person. I practice my Cherokee teachings, and I try to be very traditional. And that's a personal thing. But I think that, you know, what it has kind of come to and resulted in is a lot of uncomfortable but unavoidable positions for myself. It's something that I feel because of my appearance, it's brought on, and it's just going to happen. But nonetheless, it shouldn't be happening. I should not ever be in a position as a student journalist where an editor makes a comment about how the tribes got rich from casinos, so he doesn't cover them anymore because he covered them when they were poor and they're rich now from casinos. I'm going to leave that there. And had I been less white passing, and if I had gone to Title IX or HR to file a complaint, would something more have happened than my superiors choosing to just stay out of it? Maybe. But I can't say that for sure because of the scarcity of Indigenous affairs in this industry. They just do not have a full comprehension of how to deal with these types of comments in this type of historical scope, because it's just Indigenous journalists absolutely make up the smallest minority of journalists in leading newsrooms. We make up less than half of 1%. So I'm a very, very small minority in newsrooms, nonetheless. So that just really creates this environment where it's really hard to deal with the idea of I'm Indigenous, but I don't look like it. So how do they treat me? But also they know that I've been doing it for so long, so they don't want to offend me. So they default to my knowledge all the time. And kind of going back to what Dr. Karstarsman was saying, was the idea that giving Indigenous folks a voice for themselves, but not necessarily meaning that they need to give voice to all. She has definitely given me a space to, give myself my own voice within my indigeneity. Each Indigenous person is going to be different, and to try to have one, senior journalism student from the University of Oklahoma have an extended knowledge of all tribal cultures around the country is not realistic, and it's tokenizing. Because you're assuming that because I'm Indigenous, I must know everything. And I know a lot, sure. I mean, I've done this for 4 years. I know a lot. I don't know everything. And so, you know, going back to what Maida was saying, it's really, really important that we give each individual Indigenous person their own voice to be who they are within their indigeneity, because it's very, very complex. And something that I'm always thinking about in terms of the complexity of identity is the complexity of the intersections of our histories. I'm thinking of the histories between just every group that has touched Native American history, which is pretty much all of them. I'm thinking back to a story that I did on freedmen descendants earlier this fall. And that's a very, very complex history. And, you know, Native American history, very, very much connected with African American history. And it very much stayed that way. And I think that the importance of understanding that our generational and historical suffering has been mingled and not separate. We have a shared struggle as BIPOC individuals. And I think that to understand that from a generational ancestral level is really, really important, to just kind of understanding the dualities, like you said, of being kind of in both of these positions at once and straddling these two worlds. So to kind of put all that in perspective, I just try to use the historical context of all of our minority groups, because we're all connected. And I definitely believe that. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind as you try to straddle the two worlds, and whichever worlds that we're trying to straddle. So.
Beautifully said, Nancy. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the transparency in what you're sharing through your experiences and trying to articulate these just super complex phenomenon that you've described with us. And one thing before I forget, I think it would be wonderful if you could put some of your articles in the chat, or maybe share them with the IPR folks, because I know I want to read them, I want to cite them, and just learn more. So that would be wonderful. I'd like to, if I may, direct some attention to Dr. Azokar and ask this. Journalism and PR are so closely related that we can benefit so much from your insights as a journalism professor and journalist. But my question is, what aspects of journalism do you think are most effective in engaging students in discussions of Indigenous groups? And then how might we PR practitioners, or I'm sorry, PR scholars, or some of us are scholar practitioners, leverage that and use that? So the first part is, how or what aspects of journalism do you think are the most effective in engaging students in discussions of Indigenous groups? And then how might we PR folks piggyback on that and utilize it?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I think it follows a lot of the stuff that Nancy was saying. So, you know, I joke that I teach grammar, but if you think about the importance of grammar and language in journalism and PR. And so I want to start with this idea of a political identity versus a racial identity. And to move past this language that we're using, that I see in the chat, that we've heard of full blood, half blood, mixed. Like, that is a colonizer language that was imposed on us in order to get rid of us. So tribally, we decided who our members were, right? There wasn't any like, well, are you a quarter blood? Are you half blood? Are you, our tribes decided who was members, and some tribal members were not native. They didn't have any, they were part of the tribe. And we can think of things like the freedmen, right? And how they came to be part of the tribe. And so it's really critical for us to stop using that language. And when we're doing work on like editing, if we come to those ideas, it's like, well, let's think about how that language came in. And the reason that language came in, and that's government imposed in order to get rid of us. Because say you have a full blood Cherokee and a full blood Upper Mattaponi, and we have a child, that child is now half blood and can only be one tribe for the government. And then that child marries somebody of a different tribe and they have a tribe. No, technically they're still all native, but now they're only a quarter blood. And so eventually the government gets its way and says, well, there's no more Indians, right? And that's exactly what Walter Plecker wanted to do. And he said, let's just do it more quickly and let's get rid of all of them. And so when we are teaching about language and using these language like a political identity, a tribal citizen, the idea of what is sovereignty, like educating yourself, what does sovereignty mean? Sovereignty is a government to government relationship between a tribe and the US government. It means we have a say in maintaining our cultures, our heritage. It means that we get to negotiate with the government. One of the most important chapters that I did in my book was called Why Federal Recognition Does Not Equate to a Casino. And that chapter came about because I interviewed Arlinda, I totally just forgot her last name, Arlinda Locklear, who was the first Native woman, a licensed lawyer to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court. And she broke down for me the steps. And once a tribe gets federal recognition, how hard it is to get a casino. And that's really a 10-year process. And so it was just an amazing story. Then that chapter was not supposed to be in my book, but it came to be. And so listening to these stories is so important. We weren't counted in the census until 1850. And even then it was Indians untaxed, right? So this is all very, we don't know political Indian history because the government doesn't want us to know Indian political history. And I really think of the book 1619 and Nicole Hannah-Jones and how she really talks about how we don't know this because to know it means that we understand it and we can fight against it. And so I got to see her a couple of weeks ago in San Francisco, and that really resonated with me. It's like, that's why nobody knows Native history. It's because they don't want you to know Native history. So I think normalizing bringing in Indigenous stuff into classes like grammar, right? Let's read this article and pick it and talk about why it's not correct and why just because there's a story about federal recognition, all of a sudden there's a casino in there. Like, we didn't talk about the casino. A casino was brought in by the reporter who brought that in. And why? Because this is association in people's heads. Just like Nancy said, there's an association like, well, she doesn't look Indian. Well, people think that I'm Arab, right? That's like my identity that people have put upon me. And people look at Nancy and Nancy says, well, you're white. What do you know about Indians? And that's because people don't understand this idea of political identity versus racial identity. And so we can bring those stories in. I think doing things like I made my students, for extra credit, watch the series Reservation Dogs. That is such an amazing story from an Indigenous perspective that completely dispels every myth about Indians that you ever had. Right? So you watch that and it's like, that is life. I also have my students listen to the podcast Census Powwow. Right? A Census Powwow was its snap judgment, and it was done by Julian Brave Noisecat, and it's an amazing, just our great story, and picking apart like what that story is, and the students are enjoying the story, but they're also really getting this understanding of Indigenous life that they might not have access to because we don't give them just normalized access to. The other thing that I try to do in these my social impact classes is like connecting, doing this land acknowledgement, really connecting it. So, we're in San Francisco. We just had the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Alcatraz. That was started by San Francisco State students. Like, it was instrumental. And so I make them watch the movie and then talk. We have questions about how were San Francisco State students involved from all these tribes when they were from all over the place. And that way we can talk about the relocation. So I think just getting to students to engage is not having this like, okay, it's Thanksgiving, let's talk about Indians now. Let's talk about Indians in every aspect of what we're doing, from language to source development to all of these aspects of journalism, instead of separating it, because by separating it, you're just doing what's already been done, is separate, putting us into this separate category of something special that you have to deal with. And when you're giving resources of reporting resources, just add Naja in there as like a, here's just another resource. So I hope that answered your question. And there might have been a second part that I forgot to write down, but I think that I've been successful in getting my students to feel comfortable asking questions just by adding it in kind of everyday reporting classes.
Thank you so much. No, that more than answered the question. Absolutely. And I see that there's a good bit of activity in the chat. So I want to turn attention there for some questions. And I see one from Dr. Natalie Tyndall. And Dr. Tyndall, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, or I can as well? I guess you can.
Well, hello, everyone. So my question was just basically, if Indigenous journalists are fewer than 1% of journalists in the US, what is the percentage of Indigenous persons who are working in PR and strategic communication industries, and what's the impact of that? And I guess for the panelists who are working on the journalism side, I guess it's really having an understanding of when you're encountering people who are resources and things like that, are you encountering other people who are Indigenous, who are public relations practitioners, and how is that? I'm just curious. Thank you.
So can I hop in to start, because I have something that might be a little bit illuminating. I can't answer your question as far as giving you a direct statistic for how many PR or comm majors there are. What I can tell you is that I did a very interesting study for a final project that I was doing for a data class, and I did it on educational attainment in Indigenous communities. What I was actually looking at was the educational attainment of Indigenous folks in tribal colleges versus mainstream colleges and universities. And what you find is that I think there's a lot of cultural implications for the career paths that Indigenous folks choose to take. And I think that definitely plays into part of why you see so little PR, comm, journalism people that are Indigenous in these fields. What you see a lot, and at least when I was doing research, and I'll go into a different aspect of data and why that's important. This is all kind of related, but essentially when I was doing research on this, I kept finding very little data. Very, very, very little data was available on the educational attainment, enrollment, outcomes of these Indigenous students across the board on different educational levels. And what I found was that going back to the cultural implications, usually what happens is they major in something and get a degree in something that they can then take back to their tribes and work for. So that usually ends up being something like PR sometimes, and just kind of general communications. And a lot of them go into agriculture. A lot of them go into the land part of all of their tribal economies and things like that. But you just don't, what I saw in my research is you didn't see a lot of educational outcomes that resulted in directly communication degrees or journalism degrees. And I think that there's cultural implications because for me, when I saw that data, what I took that to mean as well, there's obviously a very big distrust in both the federal government and the mainstream media for Indigenous people. Indigenous people have a very hard time trusting, contributing to, feeling comfortable around federal government and mainstream media. So I think that there's just a lack of hope that they can really do good in those fields. I think that it's just something that they already feels in some cases. I mean, I've talked to folks who were wanting to go into these fields before, and the reason that they were like, no, was because of they just didn't think it would do anything good for their tribe. They didn't think that having that elevated platform for communication was going to really do them or their tribe personally any good. So they would get a degree and go back home to their tribe and work for their tribe and put the economy and things back into their tribe. And that leads to my next point, which is the fact that data genocide is a very, very big problem in Indian country. And it's one of the biggest things that needs to be addressed very quickly because of the fact that so much depends on data, just across the board. You know, tribes get calculated federal funding based on data that these institutions have. And when the institutions have data that's incomplete or inaccurate, they're going to receive inadequate funding chronically and systemically. And so I think that that kind of plays into the larger issue of infrastructure issues in Indian country. And it all plays back to data and media representation and what Indigenous people choose to put their voices into. So I hope that doesn't really answer your question probably, but I hope that kind of illuminate a little bit of what you were hoping to find.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you. Another question that I think we've kind of touched upon it a lot with so much that's already being said, but I wonder if we might bring it home, transitioning a bit from PR to journalism, and I guess this might be an appropriate question for all of you guys. How do you think how can we move beyond Indigenous communities being overlooked in DEI? The original question we had is, why are they overlooked? But I think all of the comments that you've shared have moved us in a different direction. So I'd like to go in that different direction. So maybe one of you guys might like to speak on that a little bit. What can we do about that, the overlooking?
So I'll get the ball rolling with just a couple of ideas to also piggyback on what my colleagues have said in that last question. First of all, we need, as a profession, to bring it back to the PR realm, the need for research. And we need a point of view that allows us to ask questions about things that we think are fundamental to our understanding of the practice or our understanding of theory. So, very basically, that's an excellent question. How many Indigenous practitioners are in the field and where are they? Nancy alluded to something that we typically overlook, but there are practitioners in tribal nations who are doing public information for their nations. Do we ever think about them as we think about PR? Maybe we should. The other, the notion of doing research also, to me, suggests that we need to familiarize ourselves with broad categories of research areas and foci that are outside of PR, but could have tremendous relevance. So broadly speaking, research and scholarship that by Indigenous scholars that look at Indigenous ways of knowing are fundamental. If we want to talk about having an impact as an organization, as a business, as anything, we need to understand how others receive information and what's salient and what's meaningful, and not just work on what we feel are tried or true assumptions. Take our most fundamental conceptual construct, the situational theory of publics, which is foundational. We study it. It's been amplified. There are many variations, but at what point do we need to stop and say, what does this theory mean in an Indigenous context? Just think about the fascinating and the opportune scholarly and conversation that needs to be had. What is a public in a Navajo nation? What is a public in Cherokee? And the idea of sovereignty is so key. So we need to educate ourselves on what that concept means in the context of our Indigenous neighbors. And I want to recommend a chapter. I'm happy to put together some resources after this, but Paul Domain, who is the former editor of News from Indian Country, very influential online publication. He wrote the best explanation that I know of on sovereignty, and it's called The Notion of Somebody Sovereign, Why Sovereignty is Important to Tribal Nations. And it's in the Carstarvin and Sanchez book on American Indians in Media. It is a challenge to understand sovereignty is key, and yet sovereignty for a tribal nation is not the same as Germany's sovereignty, because they're of the complex relationship with the federal government and even within state jurisdictions. And we should school ourselves on that. And the final point, just kind of throwing it out for discussion, I think part of the challenge for us in the profession is to limit ourselves to thinking statistically, okay? So we look at census data, for instance, and 333 million people, total population. And then we want to look at what's the percentage of Native Americans, 3% nationally. But that is not the story. And we're not analysts of demographics. And if we allow ourselves to stay there, then we are going to say, well, it's not important, it's not worth it, that's a small percentage. And what do we do with that? The questions I think we need to ask have to do with influence. And it's completely embedded in place and history and culture in huge ways. If we look at just even from the indigenous-based protests, and we have literature on protest PR, Dakota Pipeline, okay? Look at what happened there. It wasn't about numbers. It was about a profound network that was global, and an influence and an ability to speak to an issue that transcended identity, in a sense that the ecology, rather, the environment is something we all share. And there are conversations like that happening all over Indian country that are not going to be isolated from the rest of the country or even the rest of the world, because indigeneity is global.
That's a word and a beautiful place to end, I think. Thank you. I just would say thank you so much. I mean, if there's one last question someone wants to get in, you got about 30 seconds. I hate to cut it off. I feel like this could go on indefinitely. And just so much wonderful information from all of our panelists. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And with that, I guess I'll thank everybody one more time. Thank you very much. And wish everyone a wonderful holiday season. And thanks again. And bye-bye.